Imagine a world where the fate of nations hung on actions that would never make headlines. A world where victories were measured in silence and failure meant vanishing without record. In the long shadow of the Cold War, while superpowers postured in public and threatened annihilation, a quieter war unfolded in back alleys, mountain passes, and rooms where the lights were always low. This is the story of the men who fought the war without flags or acknowledgement. Men trained to exist between legality and deniability. Men whose missions were whispered only in classified briefings and buried in redacted files. This is the story of Delta Force and the unseen role it played alongside the CIA, shaping history from the dark while the world slept. The origins of Delta Force were not announced with ceremony or press releases. They were born from fear and frustration. By the late 1960s, American intelligence had learned a hard lesson. Conventional forces were divisible, too slow, too accountable for a conflict defined by deception. The CIA needed something different, a force that could move without leaving fingerprints, a unit that could cross borders without ever officially crossing them. From this need emerged a ghost unit, designed not for battlefield glory, but for plausibly deniable action. Officially, it barely existed. Unofficially, it became a blade kept sharp for moments when diplomacy failed and open war was unthinkable. Selection was ruthless. There were no advertisements, no open applications. Candidates were quietly approached, often without explanation. They came from elite backgrounds, Rangers, Green Berets, men who had already survived combat and proven their nerve. Training stripped them down and rebuilt them. They learned to shoot in darkness, to navigate cities without maps, to blend into crowds where a wrong glance could mean death. Language training followed, cultural immersion, psychological pressure that never let up. Every man had to be capable of operating alone, cut off, with no rescue promised. If captured, they would be disavowed. If killed, they would be erased. Their earliest deployments never appeared on deployment rosters. Small teams slipped into places Americans were never meant to be. Eastern Europe, the edges of the Iron Curtain. The goal was not conquest, but knowledge. Listening posts hidden in forests. Surveillance of supply routes. Quiet sabotage designed to look like accidents. A train derailment blamed on faulty tracks. A fire explained as electrical failure. Each mission fed intelligence pipelines that shaped policy in Washington. The men on the ground knew none of this. They knew only the weight of their rucksacks and the constant tension of moving through hostile territory where every sound carried. Behind the Iron Curtain, fear had a taste. Cold metal in the mouth, stale air in abandoned buildings, the heavy silence after footsteps passed close. Delta operators worked alongside CIA case officers to identify Soviet assets and exploit weaknesses. They assisted defectors in escaping across borders under cover of night. They gathered evidence of weapons programs and troop movements that would later appear in briefing books marked top secret. Sometimes they planted listening devices so small they could be concealed in walls with bare hands. And patience. Sometimes they destroyed equipment that would slow Soviet operations just enough to matter. Every action was calculated to avoid escalation. A shot fired was a failure. Survival depended on restraint. In Southeast Asia, the lines blurred even further. Officially, Delta Force did not exist in Laos or Vietnam. Unofficially, their fingerprints were everywhere. Posing as advisors, technical specialists, or simply ghosts, they accompanied CIA-backed units into jungles thick with humidity and fear. They trained indigenous forces, scouted enemy positions, and conducted reconnaissance that regular units could never be assigned. The jungle swallowed sound and light. Rain turned trails into mud and weapons into liabilities. In these conditions, Delta operators learned to trust instincts over orders. A snap twig could mean an ambush. A sudden quiet could be worse. Their presence changed outcomes without ever appearing in after-action reports. As the Cold War intensified, so did the stakes. Nowhere was this more evident than in Afghanistan. When Soviet tanks rolled into Kabul, Washington responded cautiously. Open confrontation risked catastrophe. Instead, The CIA expanded a proxy war, and Delta Force was pulled deeper into the shadows. Small teams helped assess Mujahideen fighters, advised on tactics, and coordinated the flow of weapons that would bleed a superpower slowly and invisibly. High in the mountains, breath burned in frozen air. Every movement was a negotiation with terrain and trust. These missions were not about quick victories. They were about patience, about shaping conditions that would echo for decades. It was during this era that Delta's role in counterterrorism began to crystallize. Hostage rescue scenarios were rehearsed endlessly in mock buildings and aircraft shells. The margin for error was zero. A wrong step could kill civilians and ignite international crises. Real-world operations followed, some successful, some tragically flawed. Failures were classified, their lessons learned in silence. Operators carried the weight of those losses without public acknowledgement. They mourned teammates whose names would never be spoken on memorials. The cost was personal and permanent. Courage, in this world, meant carrying on without recognition. Not every mission went as planned. Equipment. Failed intelligence proved wrong. Allies turned unreliable. In the dark world of clandestine warfare, uncertainty was constant. Delta Force learned through blood and regret. Tactics evolved. Communication improved. Psychological screening tightened. Each mistake became a lesson written into doctrine that would save lives later. The men adapted because they had to. There was no alternative. Quitting was not an option. Extraction was never guaranteed. Survival depended on preparation and trust, the quiet confidence that the man beside you would act without hesitation when everything went wrong. The impact of these shadow wars was subtle but profound. Soviet influence eroded in places it once dominated. Intelligence gained through covert action informed arms control talks and strategic decisions at the highest levels. Delta Force operations rarely tipped scales dramatically, but they nudged them quietly and persistently. The Cold War was not won in a single moment. It was shaped by thousands of small actions carried out by people whose names would never be known. This deniability protected governments, but isolated the warriors themselves, leaving them to wrestle with moral questions long after missions ended. Those questions lingered. What is the cost of secrecy? What does it mean to fight for ideals that require you to hide your own existence? Delta Force operators lived in this tension. They accepted that history would move on without them, that credit would go elsewhere, that their sacrifices would be measured only in outcomes, not acknowledgement. Some struggled with this silence. Others embraced it as part of the duty they had chosen. In the end, the ethical weight of deniable operations remains unresolved, a shadow cast long after the Cold War's end. In recent years, fragments of the truth have begun to surface. Declassified documents hint at missions once considered too sensitive to acknowledge. Redacted reports confirm what veterans always knew, that Delta Force played a far greater role in Cold War intelligence operations than previously admitted. Occasionally, former operatives speak in careful terms, choosing words that reveal emotion without violating oaths. They talk about fear, about loyalty, about the quiet pride of having done what was asked when the stakes were highest. Their stories are incomplete by necessity, but they offer glimpses into a world built on trust and silence. These revelations matter, not for glory, but for understanding. Modern special operations trace their lineage to lessons learned in those shadow years. The integration of intelligence and direct action, the emphasis on precision over mass, the recognition that the most consequential battles are often fought where no cameras are allowed. Delta Force's Cold War experience shaped doctrines that continue to guide missions today, in conflicts just as complex and morally ambiguous. As we look back, it is tempting to romanticize the shadows, to imagine clean victories and clear lines between right and wrong. The reality was messier. It was human. It was men making impossible decisions under crushing pressure, knowing that success meant anonymity and failure meant oblivion. They operated not for medals or recognition, but because someone had to stand in the dark and hold the line. The Cold War ended without the apocalypse many feared, but not without scars. Some of those scars belong to the men of Delta Force, carried quietly through ordinary lives that followed extraordinary service. Their war was never declared. Their victories were never celebrated. Yet the world we inherited was shaped, in part, by their unseen hands. And in the end, perhaps that is the true measure of their legacy, not what we remember, but what we never had to endure because they were already there, waiting in the shadows.